All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into a true crime story that's been all over the world for over 2 decades.
Yeah.
The Hae Min Lee
Oh,
case.
yeah, this case is just crazy.
It's not just a simple murder mystery. This is a story that's really made people debate about truth and justice and what even is
Yeah,
evidence.
it really is. And what gets me is how this, like, regular high school thing
Mm,
became this global phenomenon. A lot of that is because of the podcast Serial. It really got everyone into true crime. But it also shows how our justice system can really mess up.
absolutely. Let's rewind back to the start. 1999, Baltimore. Hae Min Lee, popular 18-year-old. About to graduate high school, she vanishes on January 13th. Her family and friends are in total shock.
I can't even imagine. It's like the worst nightmare. Not knowing where your kid is. Then weeks later, February 9th, they find her body in Leakin Park. And the investigation gets really, really serious.
Tragic. Cause of death was strangulation. The police immediately start looking at Hae Min's ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed, and this is where it gets tricky.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. So the prosecution really leaned on the testimony of Jay Wiles, a friend of Adnan's. Jay said he helped Adnan bury Hae Min's body. But his story had all these, like, holes in it. It kept changing. It really made you wonder if he was telling the truth.
Right, and this is what Serial was so good at. Sarah Koenig, the host, she went through all of Jay's different stories, like piece by piece, looking at the timeline and everything, and she found all these things that didn't add up. And millions of people listening were doing the same thing, trying to figure out what was actually true.
Yeah, it was so good. What was really interesting is how Serial didn't try to say whether Adnan was innocent or guilty. They just laid out the facts, the contradictions, the questions that nobody had answers to. They let the listeners decide. It was like a neutral investigation. And that made it so compelling and so influential.
I totally agree. And when they looked at all the evidence, they found a big problem. Besides what Jay said, there was nothing that physically connected Adnan to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing.
Yeah, and that's what makes the prosecution's case so shaky. It's like they were relying way too much on what Jay said.
Right. Then there's Asia McClain. She went to school with Adnan, and she said she saw him at the library. At the time the murder supposedly happened, but they never talked about her alibi at the trial.
Wow. Imagine that. Someone who could prove he was somewhere else.
Yeah.
And they just ignored her. It makes you wonder what else they missed.
It really does. After Serial came out, people started wondering if they got the wrong guy. The podcast really opened everything up. Everyone was talking about it. And there were all these new legal challenges.
Yeah, it really changed everything. It showed that podcasts can be more than just entertainment. They can show injustices and get people demanding answers.
And those demands for answers, they led to some really big changes in the case, stuff that made things even more confusing and really made us rethink everything we thought we knew.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So Serial gets everyone interested again. They find out there's not a lot of evidence, and everybody wants to know what's going to happen.
It's a wild story.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not over yet.
So Serial gets everyone looking at this case again, and they realize there's not a lot of evidence, and the public wants answers.
Yeah, and all that attention really forced the state to take a hard look at their case. Like, did they actually have the right guy? Remember we talked about the lack of physical evidence?
Yeah. Besides Jay's story, there were no fingerprints or DNA, nothing putting Adnan at the scene.
Right. But in 2018, DNA technology had advanced a lot. They could test things they couldn't test back in '99, like Hae Min Lee's clothes.
Okay, so they can finally analyze the physical evidence.
Exactly.
What did they find?
Get this. They didn't find Adnan Syed's DNA on anything.
Wow, after all this time, after everyone thinking he did it, his DNA isn't even there.
It was a huge deal. It doesn't mean he's innocent for sure,
Eh.
but it definitely makes you question everything.
No kidding. And remember how we talked about the prosecution having to turn over evidence that could help the defense? Like, that's a thing, right?
Yeah. It's called a Brady violation. They have to disclose anything that can help the other side. And it seems like they didn't do that in Adnan's case.
Really? So they might have hidden evidence that could have helped Adnan? What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, in the motion to vacate Adnan's conviction, they mentioned a couple things. One was that there were other possible suspects, but they didn't really look into them. And they never told Adnan's lawyers about them.
So they just zeroed in on Adnan and ignored other leads.
Pretty much.
That's unbelievable.
And the second thing, there was information about someone who had threatened to kill Hae Min Lee before she was murdered, and the prosecution knew about it.
Hold on. Someone threatened Hae Min, and the prosecution knew, but they didn't tell Adnan's lawyers.
Yeah.
That's messed up.
It really makes you wonder if Adnan got a fair trial.
So what happened then? Did they just let Adnan go?
Well, they had to do something. With the new evidence and the possible Brady violations, they decided to drop all charges against Adnan Syed. In October of 2022.
Wow. After more than 20 years, Adnan is finally free.
It's crazy.
It's like a movie, but this is the Hae Min Lee case, so I know there's another twist coming. There's
Yep.
always another twist.
So Adnan is celebrating,
Hmm?
but Hae Min Lee's family is still hurting. They still don't know exactly what happened, and her brother, Young Lee,
Huh.
he decided to appeal the decision.
That makes sense. He deserves answers, especially after all these years.
Yeah. And he wasn't saying Adnan was guilty. He was saying that the hearing to vacate the conviction wasn't done right. He didn't get enough notice. So he couldn't go and talk to the court.
So it wasn't about the evidence. It was about the process.
Exactly.
And the appellate court agreed with him.
Yep. They said Young Lee's rights were violated because he didn't get enough notice.
So even though the prosecution dropped the charges, Adnan's exoneration was overturned because of a technicality.
It just goes to show you, the legal system is so complicated, one little thing can change everything.
Wow.
And the court also said the prosecution didn't do a good job explaining why they thought these other suspects might have done it.
So they can't just say someone else might be guilty. They have to back it up.
Yeah, they have to have real evidence and reasoning.
So where does that leave Adnan?
Well, technically he was guilty again, but they allowed him to stay free while his lawyers appealed the decision. And then in August of 2024, the Maryland Supreme Court made a ruling.
Oh, wow. What did they say?
They agreed with the lower court about the notice given to Young Lee. So Adnan's conviction was officially back in place.
Oh, man.
But they also ordered a new vacatur hearing. So Adnan gets another chance to have his conviction overturned.
So he could still be exonerated.
Exactly. And for now, he's still free. While they wait for the new hearing, it's a tough situation. Hae Min Lee's family still wants closure, and Adnan Syed is still fighting to clear his name.
It's wild to think after all this time, after all these investigations and trials and a podcast that everyone listened to this, the Hae Min Lee case still isn't over.
Yeah, it really shows you how complicated the justice system is. I mean, think about it. We put so much trust in what people say on the stand and in forensic evidence. But then there's human error and problems with the system itself. And it all affects how we find the truth.
And then there's Hae Min Lee's family. They're still grieving. And they've been in the spotlight this whole time. I can't imagine how hard it's been for them.
Absolutely. And Adnan Syed, innocent or guilty, he spent so much of his life in prison, it makes you think.
It really does. It reminds you that these cases aren't just stories. They're real people's lives.
Exactly. And when we're listening to true crime podcasts or watching documentaries, we have to remember that these are real people, not just entertainment.
Right. We have to think critically, question what we're hearing, and remember that there are usually more questions than answers.
And even though Adnan's conviction is back, the fact that there are other suspects and the questions about the original evidence, like the DNA, makes you wonder.
So what happens now with the Hae Min Lee case? What should we be looking for as this new hearing comes up?
Well, the prosecution has their work cut out for them. They have to convince everyone that Adnan is guilty, even though his DNA wasn't there. And Jay's story is shaky.
That's a tough one.
I think they'll probably focus on any new evidence and try to explain why the investigation back then wasn't thorough enough.
And what about Adnan's lawyers?
They'll probably focus on the lack of physical evidence and point out all the problems with Jay's story. They'll push hard for those other suspects. And Asia McClain's alibi could be important too.
Sounds like both sides have a lot to do.
It really shows you that finding truth and justice isn't easy. It's not always clear. There are twists and turns, setbacks and breakthroughs. And sometimes even after all that, we're left with more questions than answers.
But the Hae Min Lee case keeps us thinking.
It makes us question what we believe about the justice system and about guilt and innocence.
Well, we've covered a lot today, but this is just the beginning of this story.
If you want to learn more, definitely listen to Serial and keep up with the latest developments.
Keep asking questions. Don't just accept what you hear. And remember the real people at the heart of this case.
The search for truth and justice never really ends.
That's all for today's deep dive. We'll be back next week with another story that will make you think.
Until then, keep exploring and keep questioning.
And keep the conversation going.